And welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. Honor today to have on Tim Goeglein. Tim, how are you doing today?
I'm doing just great, Josh. It's so wonderful to be your guest.
And so we are recording this prior to the beginning of 2022, but it's going to release at the beginning of 2022. And so we are looking at the new year. Of course, this year we're going to have some important elections, but it's going to be an important year in American public life. And so I wanted to take this episode to think about the future of the American Republic, the future of the American experiment, and specifically how we as American Christian citizens could be most strategic in how we engage our nation. I'm going to jump into your bio here in just a moment, but you've written a book, American Restoration, How Faith, Family, and Personal Sacrifice Can Heal Our Nation. And so I wanted to dig into that and get your opinion on how, as we're thinking about 2022, we can be strategic in our citizenship, just like perhaps we'll be strategic in our exercise and other issues in our life.
Yeah.
So, Tim, again, just blessed to have you on. Tim is the Vice President of External and Government Relations for Focus on the Family. Formerly, he served as a special assistant to President George W. Bush and as a Deputy Director of the White House Office of Public Liaison. He was the president's principal outreach contact for conservative and faith-based groups. He has a number of other credentials, such as service at the Heritage Foundation. But I wanted to dial in on the book, American Restoration. So, Tim, I know that's just a brief part of your experience, but would you dive in and share a little bit with us about your background and your current position?
Well, I'd be honored to. I was born and raised in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And, I'm paraphrasing Ronald Reagan, who said that everything, good in his life began at Eureka College. And, everything good in my life began in Fort Wayne, Indiana. I was so blessed, honored, privileged to grow up in a happy home. I had extraordinary parents. My mother's now deceased. My father's my best friend, very much alive and a good Hoosier. And, wonderful grandparents, wonderful aunts and uncles, cousins. And it was a great place to grow up. I had a wonderful neighborhood, wonderful schools, etc. And, no growing up experience is perfect. No family is perfect. And so I'm really not overstating it, but it was a wonderful foundation. And when I was a very young boy, I knew very early on in my life, Josh, that I was very interested in this combination of politics, the press, public policy, and always thought that there would be something in my life where I would be able to be in the public square. And for the first part of my life, I don't mind saying, I thought that was going to be journalism and the media. But, Providence has a remarkable way of intervening, not when you most expect it, but often when you least expect it.
Sure.
And without going into all the details, when I was at Indiana University, I was asked to apply for an internship in the United States Senate with former Indiana Senator, later Vice President Dan Quayle. That was a remarkable summer in my life. And the next summer, I interned in the House of Representatives. So within 2 summers, I had interned in both the House and Senate. And a great mentor of mine helped arrange an internship at NBC News here in Washington, D.C. And I worked for one of the most eminent journalists in the history of CBS and NBC. So these were remarkably formative experiences, in my life. Married to the person of my dreams of 30 years, 2 sons. And, you look left, you look right, you realize that, 10 years in the Senate, nearly 8 years at the White House, entering 13 years here as the vice president in Washington for Focus on the Family. And you realize that you have to be humble because Providence intervenes at important details in a person's life and begins to form the things that we might not even be able to plan for.
This is one of my favorite questions, asking whether pastors that have been called into the public square, individuals like yourself, did you have a sense of calling into this? You mentioned kind of an interest in this area early on in life, but even perhaps the move over from the White House to focus on the family? I'm just interested in
Right.
perhaps the spiritual aspect of that.
I'm so glad you asked that question. I have a very dear friend who has a very dear friend who was the president of a large college for many years. And at the very end of every school year, everybody in the college who was going to be a pastor or a missionary, maybe a principal or a teacher in a Christian school, they had a wonderful service in the college chapel. And my great friend's friend said, well, what about everybody else? What about the people who are not going to be a pastor or a headmaster or principal in a Christian school or a teacher or a missionary, but maybe they're going to be bankers or authors or go into politics or medicine? And his friend said, in the concept of vocation, he said, as the head of this college, I've always focused on people formally going into the ministry. And, Josh, the basis of your question is that all of work is worship. When you are a Christian, your vocation, your calling, your ministry, the thing that providence intends you to do, is sometimes simpatico, which is to say it's in line. Gosh, you're a pastor, you're a missionary, you're a teacher in a Lutheran school. But for a lot of us, in the House, in the Senate, in the White House, working in a ministry like Focus on the Family, spending a lot of my time, in the Supreme Court, in the federal courts, working with members of the media, working in the think tank community. I've seen, Josh, that that's a calling. It's and I say that with great humility, not with arrogance, but with great humility. It is very much a vocation, and very much, as much of a vocational call as if I were, formally, in the ministry. So I believe in the Christian life, being called into the public square, is something that you can plan for, but ultimately it's how providence and God steer the course and the nature of our life.
And I appreciate that testimony. And we certainly need pastors and Christian school leaders. We need more of them for sure. But we also need Christians to be where God has called them to be and where he's equipped them to serve. And one of our big distinctives is we're called to follow Jesus in every area of our life, including our role as citizen. And that's one of the reasons I was looking forward to discussing this with you. Now, we could probably go ahead.
Yeah, and you'll forgive me for a minute. I'm interrupting you, but I pray for a good reason. Because I'm very eager not to miss the point that you just made. I have been very pleased to have 25 years of interns. They're everything now. They're doctors, they're lawyers, they're in public life, they're pastors, they're missionaries, they're educators, they're all the things you can imagine. And, many of them, in interning for and with me have come at some point at the very end of their internship to say, I'm trying to figure it all out. Should I go on to graduate school? Should I go to law school? What about going to a foreign country, et cetera? And one of the things, Josh, that I have stressed with every one of those interns is that what you are doing professionally today will likely be very different professionally what you're doing 5 or 10 years from now. But the point is that God uses all of it. If I, as a boy in Fort Wayne, had not started working in television news, if I were not, writing particular things, if I hadn't gone to the School of Journalism, I think of all these various experiences that at the time seemed that my professional trajectory was in one way or the other. But I've come to see now, looking backward, that God uses all of it as a kind of tapestry. And if we think of our lives as a series of chapters and tapestries, that is woven together, I think it's a very beautiful way to think of life, because I think it happens to be true.
Amen to that. And especially as we launch a new year, I know there's probably over the last couple of weeks been a lot of soul searching. You have kind of a quiet moment, but I'm certainly blessed looking back just at how things that I didn't understand at the time, you can see how God's been working them together for good. And so I certainly appreciate that good word. So we could probably, I know we could do an entire podcast on your time in the White House. You have, in fact, written a book about it titled The Man in the Middle, Faith in Politics in the George W. Bush Era. And we'll put that in the show notes. But I wanted to ask you if you have a favorite story, an impactful or meaningful moment from those years that you could share with the audience.
Well, I do, and it's a story of utter and complete failure.
Oh,
No.
No.
I remember being invited to a breakfast about 2 or 3 weeks ago here in Washington. And I looked around the room and I realized that almost everybody in that room was a former, formerly at the Department of Justice, formerly at the White House, et cetera. You read someone's biography or you read a profile, and it seems to be one mountaintop experience after the other. But I had a profound and enormous failure at the White House. And in fact, it was such a total and complete moral failing that I was pitched into the greatest crisis of my life. I mentioned that I grew up in Fort Wayne, and I had been asked during my time at the White House and in my time working in the United States Senate to write a newspaper column for my hometown newspaper. And the editor at the time, who's now a very good friend of mine, said, you're interested in everything. You're interested in tennis and golf. You're interested in music and the fine arts. You're interested in travel and et cetera. Write about all those things. Don't write about politics. And I can't tell you, Josh, how much I enjoyed writing those columns. And I would get these wonderful comments from people, what a nice column, or that was a nice turn of phrase. And I'm very, very crestfallen. And I mean this, to confess to you that I thought, wait a minute, that wasn't just good. That was great. I mean, gosh, wasn't I supposed to be F. Scott Fitzgerald? I mean, this was arrogance and pride of an enormous magnitude. And, I think that one of the greatest deceptions of pride and arrogance is that you end up, ultimately deceiving yourself. And I'm very sorry to say that was my trajectory. And as I write about in The Man in the Middle, chapter 1, I came back to the White House on a morning after having had a wonderful breakfast with a friend of mine near the White House. And by this time, I'm more than 7 years into a presidential administration. I was, in a position that I absolutely loved, working for George W. Bush as a special assistant to the president and the deputy director of the White House Office of Public Liaison. I mean, God had been so extraordinary in my life, and I was undeserving of all of it, truly undeserving. And I'm very sorry to confess to you and to others, and I've written about this extensively, that when I was writing those columns, I began to plagiarize. And it was not pressure. It wasn't stress. It wasn't because, I didn't know what I was doing or didn't understand. I knew exactly what I was doing, and I did it anyway. And I have no one ever to blame except for me, myself, and I. And I came back to the White House on the morning I'm telling you about, and I received an email. And the email said from a reporter, "Did you plagiarize those columns?" And as I write about in my memoir, I fell down next to my desk at the White House. And I may, God willing, pray a million more prayers in my life. But Josh, I never prayed a prayer like I did that day. It goes the following: "Oh God, because it was true." And I resigned my commission that day. Slunk out of the White House, hurt my wife, hurt my children, all my mentors, embarrassed my family, all of my own doing, all of my own volition. I was the guilty one. I was the victimizer. And, when you embarrass the president of the United States, when you embarrass a senator or a congressman, you are persona non grata. And I expected a kind of divorce to take place. And that's what I deserved. And believe it or not, George W. Bush asked me to come to the Oval Office. And I thought and deserved a woodshed moment. And I came, to the Oval Office, and it was just the president and me. And I began to apologize. And before I could get the words out, he said to me, "You're forgiven."
Mm.
And I was so stunned that I tried to apologize a second time. And before I could get the words out, he said, "Tim," he said, "grace and mercy are real. And I have known grace and mercy in my own life." And
Wow.
I was so stunned. For the third time, I tried again. And I finally got a full series of sentences where I was apologizing. And he said, "You're forgiven. Grace and mercy are real." He said, "I've known them in my own life." He said, "Now we can talk about all of this, or we can talk about the last 7 years." And he said, "I'll let you choose." And for the next few minutes, we spoke about all of our time together, 2 hard-fought presidential campaigns, time in the White House. We prayed together, and I began to depart. And before I got out of the Oval Office, he said, "By the way, I want you to bring your wife and your sons here so that I can share with them what a wonderful father and husband you've been."
Mm.
The leader of the free world, Josh, is not in the business of validating a broken person like me. And he was as good as his promise. We came to the Oval Office as a family the next week.
Wow.
President has remained a great friend. He's never mentioned this again.
Wow.
And so he was right. Grace and mercy are right. They're real. And, I was the great and extraordinary beneficiary of that kind of limitless love that I believe that, as my brother in Christ, George W. Bush could extend to me. So I wrote about this at length, and I wanted to put it first in the book, not to begin with the kind of mountaintop after mountaintop experiences, but to begin in the real valley and to understand that in the Christian life, G.K. Chesterton said it so well, that in the Christian life, often we see a better and fuller and deeper picture, not from the mountaintop, but from the valley. And I was blessed in remarkable ways. And, T.S. Eliot said, "Humility is endless." And that's right. There is great power in humility, and there is great toxicity and poison in pride. And I'm very grateful that I learned the hard way.
Wow. What a powerful story. And thank you for being willing to lead with that, to share that with us. I cannot imagine how difficult that was, but just a beautiful story first about your own willingness just to accept, I did this, but then what a powerful example of grace and mercy and leadership from the president. It's just so much there. So thank you for sharing that story.
Yep.
I wanted to turn now to the question at hand. And I know many listeners, we're Christians first. And so our ultimate allegiance is to Christ and to his kingdom. But we are called to be good citizens of the United States. And
Yeah.
the United States, though it has its flaws, is a remarkable experiment. And it's certainly troubled. I don't think we have to prove that too much. So often ask the question, where do we go next? And I wanted to ask your opinion about that. And when you're actually back in Fort Wayne at an event, you led with the description of the current crisis as a spiritual one. And so I wanted to start there. Would you dig into that a little bit and explain kind of the current crisis, diagnose the problem, so then we can talk about solutions?
Well, I'd be honored and happy to do it. Of course, I've written an entire book, as you say, about the beautiful narrative that you're sewing together, which in the book is called American Restoration. Because in all of my travels for Focus on the Family, whether I was in California or Texas, Indiana, New York, Idaho, take your pick, almost with pinpoint predictability, when I would finish my remarks, the hands would go up. And, I was hearing a refrain everywhere I went, which is, I've never been more concerned about my country than I am now. If the questioner had children or grandchildren, they would very often say, "I'm very concerned about my children and my grandchildren's future." And the third thing they would say, Josh, was something like, "And I don't know what to do." And I would very often say, what I would share with you in light of this. The first thing to know is that I have a love affair with America. This is an extraordinary country by any objective empirical criterion that could be applied to the course and nature of a country, a culture, and a civilization. America has been at the apotheosis, at the very height of every country that has ever existed. All you have to do is go to the beaches of Normandy and Pointe de Houx. All you have to do is read the United States Constitution, read the Federalist Papers, read the Declaration of Independence, understand what happened at Lexington and Concord Bridge, to understand the valor and the total greatness of the United States of America. It's a remarkable country, and much of it has been beset by a kind of moral relativism. And this moral relativism grows from a spiritual crisis of the first order. Our founding fathers were not of a piece, and I think that this is one of the problems when we have a discussion like this, because very often people talk about the founding generation as if they all agreed on the biggest issues, and as we all know, they all disagreed on the biggest issues. But they did not disagree about the most important thing of all. They were preoccupied about how you maintain, a freedom over time. And for all of the differences, from Alexander Hamilton to Thomas Jefferson, from John Adams to George Washington, they all agreed on one big thing, whether they were from the North or the South, from the East or the West. They literally all agreed that you could not have freedom and liberty over time in a country unless you had virtue. They understood, in the example of the Roman Republic, which of course became an empire, where we saw people moving from being citizens to being subjects, from the freedom of the Roman Senate, to the idea of the Caesars and the ruling class. And our founders understood that it is virtue, which is moral excellence in the leaders, moral excellence in the citizens. You talked about citizenship earlier in our discussion together. They were preoccupied about how you nourish and extend moral excellence in the citizenry. And they knew that in the American experience, it came directly from the Judeo-Christian tradition. They wanted a large swath for religion and faith in the public square. Some of them were Anglicans, some of them were Baptists, some of them were nonconformists, some of them were deists without a particular creed. But overwhelmingly, on this large question of moral greatness and moral excellence and fostering it, they knew that that was central to keeping religious and other kinds of freedom. And the great struggle of 21st century America is a very, very toxic secularism that is rooted in moral relativism, and which is aimed squarely at trying to erase faith and religion from our public life and from our public institutions. But I must tell you, I'm a total and complete inveterate optimist. I do not believe that they will succeed. It's not that we're having a lack of a tough time. We're having a tough time. And our institutions are withering right now a very terrible fusillade of the kind of things we're talking about. But I believe that there are millions upon millions upon millions of American citizens who understand the importance of virtue in our public life and as a cornerstone of freedom. And I believe very strongly, Josh, that we will experience a restoration and a rejuvenation. I believe that very, very strongly.
I appreciate the optimism, and it is easy to get discouraged by what we see in the news. But I do think you do have those little platoons, as Burke would call them. You have churches, you have Christians that are ready to engage. And so we have limited time tonight. I wanted to dig into a few particular issues. And one of the distinctives we've tried to hold to at the podcast is we have a lot of information, but what can we do? What can we do
Yes.
next? What can we do
Yes.
next? So the first one I think is it makes sense. All right. If this is a spiritual crisis, we need the freedom to live out our faith so that we can
Yes.
influence it. So religious liberty being our first freedom, how can American Christians work to restore a culture of religious liberty?
I'm so thrilled that you are asking this question, because if we are not free religiously, we are not free. Our religious liberty and conscience protection is the ultimate American capstone. And the author of our Constitution, James Madison, famously wrote that conscience is the most, this is Madison, the most sacred, of all property, which he's not speaking about real estate. He means the property of a constitutional republic. Conscience is the most important one. And we are given our religious liberty and conscience rights, not from government, but from God himself. This is very clear in our Constitution, and it wells up, as a matter of catechesis from our Declaration. Our founders were very clear that this Constitution was drafted for a moral and a religious people. They would have been very comfortable being on your podcast, Josh, in light of the questions that you're asking. And my view, strongly held going forward, is that people have to do something more than be discouraged or despairing. It's so easy to watch the news, read the newspaper, tap into social media, and end up discouraged or despairing. But in the Christian life, discouragement and despair is a sin, because it negates the hope of Jesus Christ. It negates the gift of hope that we are given from providence. And as we step off into this new year, the number one thing that I would encourage people to do who are watching and listening is, at the most local level, become engaged in your community, in your church, in your school. I write in American Restoration that if we are to have a restored, regenerated, and renewed country, it will not come because people here in Washington are pushing it on the 50 states, or having this come from Silicon Valley or Hollywood or any one kind of centralized location. It will not come from the top down, but rather from the bottom up. So local is best. What are we doing in our own neighborhoods? What are we doing in our churches and parishes? What are we doing in our local civic organizations? Are we running for office? Are we running for the school board? I'm extremely encouraged by this newfound love and wave of people who want to be involved in their local schools. Multiply that by a factor of 50 states. My sense is become engaged more than ever. And I believe, and I feel confident that kind of local engagement, broadly felt by people across our nation, will cause the kind of restoration that we all pray for and trust will happen. And I believe it will.
That's really encouraging. And one of the things I found very helpful in the book is, instead of trying to solve this problem of, well, do we look at the national level and should we engage and follow those things, or should we be engaged at the local level? You mentioned it's not really a problem to be solved; it's a tension to be managed. And so, yes, you have to follow along and be informed about what's going on at the national level. I often tell churches, look, most Christians will have their greatest impact in their own zip code, and
That's
so
right. Yes.
Are you engaging there? So I really welcome that admonition as we look at this new year. Don't just wring your hands about what's going on in DC. How can you get engaged in your community and make a difference? So that was a little bit on religious liberty. Another question that I had for you is, of course, marriage and family. And
yes.
Of course, we have Obergefell versus Hodges. Same-sex marriage is the law of the land for the moment. So how can Christians pursue and kind of renew a vision of family and marriage in a culture that's increasingly hostile towards that view of sexuality in marriage? How can we portray that well, but then stand for it in the public square?
We have to actively engage and create and nourish the idea of community. Social media, social platforms have enormous benefits. And we at Focus on the Family are thrilled that Focus on the Family has become such an extraordinary resource, not just across the United States, but across the world. Focus on the Family is kind of a one-stop shop resource for any and all questions concerning marriage, family, parenting, all the things, Josh, that you and I know constitute the permanent things. But the one thing that is so important with regard to your question is, what about the family? What about marriage? What about fertility? What about the idea of healthy communities and healthy cities and healthy towns? They don't come from nowhere. They come from people at the most local level, actively reaching out and building these kind of relationships across time and across years. Mobility is a very good thing, but in the life of a young person, continuity, stability, and order really matter. Intact families really matter. Mothers and fathers who are actively engaged in the lives of their children and their grandchildren is very important. Being a good citizen, we talked about this earlier. And when you expand and grow the idea of community, you open up all kinds of opportunities for the next generation to meet one another. One of the things that we at Focus on the Family hear all of the time, completely contiguous, Josh, with your great question, are young people who want to be married. They eagerly want to be married, but they find it very difficult to meet other people. And in the world that we are in, there are often social triggers, very often online or on platforms, that really keep them away from the kind of genesis of the beginning of a new strong relationship. So I think in an era of high tech, right, the kind of meeting in person and actively involving our families and our marriages, connecting with other people, real human relationships, I think that this is really key to the kind of restoration that we all pray and hope for.
So something you said at the event in Fort Wayne that really stuck with me was that you mentioned that in this particular moment, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. And
Yes.
just thinking about some of the census data that came out, I think today is when I noticed it, but that in 1970, about 40% of American households had a mom and dad and kids
Yes.
in the house. And as of this last census, it's down to 17.8%. And so just living, telling the truth is that revolutionary act among Christians these days.
We live in a large, complex, continental nation of over 350 million souls. And the quote that you are using or raising came from the great George Orwell, who had experienced, the totalitarian communism. And he understood that attacking the truth, is the way that authoritarians and eventually totalitarians often choose to navigate their world. And Orwell famously said, telling the truth in a time of mass deception, is a revolutionary act. And I believe that Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the great Nobel laureate who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, in one of his most famous speeches, he said that he was echoing a very famous Russian proverb. And Josh, he said, one word of truth will outweigh the world. And I believe that that's true. We have to go tell a new generation, we have to tell them the truth. We have to engage with this generation, because I'll tell you, whoever wants this generation is going to get them. And we have to be intentional about the way that we engage with this generation, telling them the truth of Western civilization, the truth of culture, the greatness of America. There is a push now to erase our country, to erase our history, to topple our statues, and to do something which is not kind of reformation, but revolution. Reformation and revolution are not the same thing. You mentioned Edmund Burke earlier, the greatest conservative, probably of the last 500 years. And Burke said that the concept of conservatism is that you reform in order to preserve. And I think that's right. Reform is a good thing. Restoration is a good thing, but it needs to be contiguous with first principles. And those first principles do not change.
It's excellent. And so coming to the end of our time, I had two quick questions for you. And the
Sure.
book is very helpful. You go through a number of the key issues. And so I encourage listeners to pick up the book, American Restoration, diving into things like how do you build a culture of life? How do you instill citizenship and duty? And so definitely encourage listeners to pick up the book. But I understand that you have a new book coming out soon. I wanted to give you just a moment to maybe plug that, and then I'll ask our final question.
That's so kind. Well, I do, in fact. The book will come out sometime late this year. The working title is Toward a More Perfect Union. And the narrative of the book is to look at what are the consequences of the destruction of American history. What are the consequences of the destruction of American culture? What do we get if we try to tear down the United States? If we try to attack our institutions, attack our pillars, and completely revolutionize the idea of the United States of America, what do you get? What happens? That's the narrative of the book. And I think it's very timely. I think it's very topical. And I think it's very relevant. And I pray that it will be read by numerous people who will dive into this narrative and garner something very important from it.
We'll look forward to that. We'd love to have a conversation with you when that comes out. It's very important, timely work. So last question for you. If you had a billboard on which you could put a message to kind of the gospel preaching church in the United States, or in a sense, just kind of a summary of encouragement to Christians as we look towards 2022 and how we can exercise our citizenship well.
I love that question. What a perfect final question. My posting on your billboard would be two words: relationships matter. I have learned in my time working in the United States Senate, working at the White House, working at Focus on the Family, traveling extensively in our country and abroad. In writing books, in writing columns, in speaking often, engaging with people left and right, I've really learned that civility, graciousness, magnanimity matter. Listening to other people matter. Entertaining other points of view matter. I've learned that disagreeing is not bad manners, and that it's very important to disagree agreeably. And I've learned that with grace and with civility, but unapologetically, it's really okay to take a different viewpoint than the dominant narrative. And I suppose, Josh, in one sense, that for those of us who are Christians living in the contemporary world, it becomes a way of life that we have to intentionally sometimes live counter-culturally. We have to intentionally choose to step out of the main street of a culture which is too often toxic, and to say, I'm not going to contribute to the toxicity. I'm not going to add any more poison. I am intentionally going to put on Christ, and with total humility and not arrogance, I'm going to serve and love God, and I'm going to serve and love other people and I'm going to make limitless love and grace and mercy and fortitude the kind of narrative of my life. And my view is that if God allows you to be 100 years old or whatever it is, that you can genuinely look back, not with pride, but with humility, and to understand that living counterculturally, but transformatively in a way that is pleasing to Jesus Christ is a really nice way to navigate life.
Amen. Well, thank you for that reminder and encouragement. It just sets us in, I think, the right tone in the right place to go out and engage our communities and the nation this year. So, Tim, thank you so much for taking some time to be with us. We appreciate your witness in Washington, D.C. We look forward to continuing the conversation with you.
Well, Josh, it was really an honor to be with you. I'm so thrilled that we have stepped off into this new year, and I pray for our country, our culture, and our civilization. God bless you.